Hello and warm welcome to the first of the British Cartographic Society's Teatime Talk series. This series will aim to offer a broad and wide range of talks over a wide range of topics that will hopefully be of interest to the society. This talk we've got at the moment is going to be our first and the test before the main series starts in 2 weeks' time. So this is where we'll find any issues that we hopefully will tackle before then. So I have to say it's been a great turnout so far. I can see we've had a very large number of people decide to join us. So if anything goes, if we're going by anything, that's a great mark of success. So opening the series, we have the pleasure of opening this series of talks with a talk from Seppi Cassiter, the president of the British Cartographic Society. We hope this will be of great interest to everyone, and hopefully you'll have plenty of questions at the end of this. So thank you very much, and we'll continue from here. Seppi?
Thanks, Christopher. Hopefully you can all hear me. Chris said it was a tester. Actually, I'm the guinea pig for this series, and you're the guinea pigs as the audience. So what I would say is, if there are any issues or any concerns or things you like, things you don't like, please get in touch with us, because we're trying to set up a regular sequence of small chats and talks about a variety of projects and topics. We want to get it right. We want to make it appropriate. We want to keep it quite light-hearted. We want to make it fairly enjoyable. It's the afternoon. Just to start things off, I do have my mug, which hopefully you can all see. Anybody that gives a talk, hopefully we'll get a mug. I think Christopher's organising it. So Tea Time Talks for BCS. Okay, I offered Chris this talk when he said he was going to set up these series about 9-10 months ago. And at the time, I thought I would finish the project that I'm going to talk to you about. Things being what they've been, of course, I'm a long way short of completing the project. It's certainly at a level that I was expecting to be at. Nonetheless, I'm going to dive into it, tell you a little bit about it, show you some examples of what we've been doing, and give you sort of a bit of a background on where it's all going. So this is a project that I got sucked into, which sort of talks to the two things that are of interest to me. One is, how do we map change, and how do we collect change information, and how do we record it in a way, cartographically and otherwise, that gives us both the current view of the world and what happened in the past, and how the two have interacted and affected each other. So the change is one of the things that this project is all about. And the other is the sort of history and how that impacts on the way that we represent the world, and the way that we think about the problems of today, and how we might use cartographic historical data to influence things. Now, that's my interest, but that isn't really what the project's all about. But the first slide is essentially pointing out two of the things that are of interest to me. First is, I pulled out from the Financial Times. They have said that in a study they did back in October, and things may well have changed now, that 1 in 5 of the offices within the City of London will change hands as a consequence of the pandemic. And that's a huge amount of usage change within a very complex urban environment. And they've also pointed out that something like 50% of journeys between train and workplace are going to move to being on foot or by bike. So again, we're seeing another major change. And there's lots of predictions about how the City of London and other urban areas will change going forward. The other thing I've pulled out on the left-hand side is just a reference to the new large-scale 3D model of the City of London, how we represent and view the world that we live in today, both cartographically and in these virtual models, and the two overlap and clearly have big connections between the two. So that's sort of my area of interest. The focus for this study is the photograph in the middle. It's the parish of St Helens in the City of London, what was Greater St Helens. It's not the entire parish area, but it's the majority of it. The photograph in the middle there shows you the parish church, and I'll be talking quite a lot about that later. But to put it into context, for those of you who know the city, have wandered around it, behind it is the building that's known as the Gherkin. It's not quite in the parish boundary, it's just outside, very close. And the building to the right is the Aviva Tower, or the Aviva building. So it's one of the big tower blocks in that area. So we're talking about an area of London that is constantly changing, constantly being redeveloped and redefined. But this project really started with a friend of mine, Jeff Marsh, who is the director of theatre and performance at the V&A Museum. And he's been writing a book over the last few months or more called Living with Shakespeare. And you can see the cover of it in the bottom right there. The premise that he has is that we know that Shakespeare lived in Silver Street, which is now under London Wall, from 1604. But he also believes that Shakespeare lived in the St Helens area of Bishopsgate, possibly from 1593 and probably from 1597 to 98. Now, what he's interested in, and this is where we start to overlap, is that people in theatre, in the arts, in literature, use things around them and put them into the things they write about. So the environment in which they live influences what they write. I'm no great Shakespeare scholar, so I can't say I enjoyed it at school. I haven't read very much of it subsequently. I've hardly been to a performance. Tut, you might say, but I do appreciate the importance of Shakespeare within the whole of the written canon, as it were. And certainly Jeff is very keen to point out that where Shakespeare lived influenced what he wrote. And I've just pulled out two very particular references that one's in Hamlet, one's in Richard II. The Hamlet one mentions a nunnery, and we'll see that in a moment. And the second one is a very specific one, but it's actually really quite an interesting one. It mentions a two-bucket well. Now, those of you in the know will know that a two-bucket well was pretty high tech when it comes to the world in which Shakespeare was living in. So that's the sort of background from the other end of the project. So what were we trying to do? So I'm just going to switch my pointer to laser pointer. Now, hopefully you can see a red dot sort of moving around on the screen. So the map in the background is a map of the area that we're interested in. I'm going to point it out. This is Bishopsgate Street, for those of you who know London. Along the bottom is Leadenhall Street. This is St Mary Axe. So the Gherkin is just off of this area. And you've got what was the London Wall, the black line up here. And this was Bishopsgate. So the area we're interested in is this area defined here by those four streets. And right in the middle of that, this is all part of the parish of St Helens, right in the middle of that is St Helens Church. And I've also highlighted here the Leathersellers Hall. The Leathersellers are quite important in this story because they provide a lot of the resources for which we collected information to start understanding the environment that we were looking at. Founded in 1444, they have a huge archive of information. If you're not sure about where we are within the context of the City of London, the inset shows your modern map, City of London boundary, and the red square basically is the area around the St Helens boundary. So that's the area that Jeff's interested in, and it's the area that I got involved in working with him to put together a sequence of maps and a map database of change within this area. So just zooming in a bit, just to give you a little bit more detail and a bit more context. Again, this is the St Helens Church that I'm pointing to. The area shaded with the red lines is from the evidence that Jeff's collected and from the information that we've picked up from one source or another, where he believes Shakespeare was living at the time. The blue bucket is the 2-bucket well that existed at the time, and the green star is the site of a nunnery, and that's quite important in a number of the Shakespeare's plays. Now, the map that you're looking at is a map that dates from not Shakespeare's time of 1598 or whatever period we're looking at, but a little bit later. It's a map we chose to use as a reference point for this project because it has one of the first sets of maps that we could access that has building footprints on it and a lot of detail, the sort of level of detail that you might expect in a modern OS master map product. So it was produced in just immediately after the Great Fire. The reason it's valuable to us is that we believe from the work we've done that much of the buildings in this map were as they were at Shakespeare's time. And the reason we can say that is that we've looked at the records, we've seen where the buildings are, and we know that this area was not affected by the fire. So if you look to the bottom right map, you've got the boundary of the City of London, and the pink area shows the extent of the Great Fire. The area we're interested in is the red square. So fortunately, we have a map produced immediately after the Great Fire with all the building structures in it that included the area that we're interested in and has much of what was there during Shakespeare's time. I've also highlighted in red Crosby Hall. Remember that? I'll come back and I'll reference Crosby Hall again. It's quite an important structure and feature within this area. So this is the area we're interested in. We also have evidence, though, of this nunnery. So the nunnery that's mentioned in Shakespeare's work. This is, of course, there's lots of records. There's not many good plans, but there is this one from 1799, which contains information on walls that still existed at the time and some conjecture about, excuse me, what was there. So we've used this also as a reference. There is further information about the gardens and the extent of the areas where people who were working around the nunnery could use. So we have some pretty good sources for basic mapping. So what do we want to do? We want to generate a database that shows change. In order to do that, we've really got to start, with a base map that gives us something to latch everything else onto. So really there's no other place to start but the modern day. So the first thing we did was take modern day Ordnance Survey map, redigitized it and recoded it up with some other information. And I'll just point out two features. You see I've highlighted St Helens Church. There's also another church, Ethelberger's, up here. So just keep those in mind. Those are the only two buildings that still exist from Shakespeare's day. Nonetheless, they're good reference points for what we were trying to do. If we convert the 1676 map that I was showing you that was done just after the fire into a co-reference data layer, we end up with a map that looks like this. Same structure, same information, pulling out detail of different sorts. Now, first thing I would say is it is well worth noting the level of detail between the two maps. It's quite interesting how the structure of an urban area has changed so dramatically. And I'm going to come back to the amount of change and some of the work we've been doing obviously in a few moments. We've seen this change. We had to interpret the 1676 map, make some understanding of what we were looking at, what was courtyards, what was garden areas, what were alleyways and so on. We did that sort of under advice and we've added that so that it links back in. And you'll see under the 1676 map, this is exactly as was at the time. So we don't have the nunnery. By 1676, the one thing that's missing from this area was the nunnery. So the first job was to essentially put the nunnery back into the database. Here's the map. Here's the digital version of that nunnery, added onto a digital version of the church, St Helens Church, and then added back into the structure that is the 1776 map. So this now represents for us our baseline of as close as we can get of the structures that we've got within that area of St Helens, approximately sort of 1600 or thereabouts. Everything is polygonized and classified, and you'll see within the detail of the nunnery that we've got information for point out walls, windows. You can pull out the different doors and so on and so on. And you've got all the different elements that you would expect. And those elements are quite important because we've standardized all of those with detail that we've also got from the church and from other buildings, which you'll see in a moment. Just to put it into context in terms of numbers, I mentioned the detail. The 2020 master map has 162 polygons on it. The 1676 map has 972. So it's about 4 times the level of detail. So the OS might think they've got a big task maintaining a national map base, but if they were doing it 500 years ago, they'd have a much bigger task. So we then started to fill in these two extremes. We've got the church and nunnery and the 1676 map at one end. We've got master map at the other. And we started to fill in many different map layers in between. This isn't all of them. This is just some of them. I've just pulled out some to give you some examples of what we're working on. Where we haven't finished the project is where we're trying to get consistent land use in terms of what the land is being used for. So you'll see a definite change in the colours that we're using from the earlier maps through to the more modern maps. We have collected information from all the different OS layers, which is what you're actually looking at here, as well as information on bomb damage from World War II and various other components. So just have a look at a little bit of that. So these are the maps from 1875 and 1916, both Ordnance Survey maps. There is some intermediate information, but I would point out a couple of things that are really interesting in these maps in terms of helping us understand change. First of all, we've got quite a bit of information about retail, banks, pubs, which we've coloured up, and I won't go through them. But I'm particularly interested in the detail around the church and the sort of information that you can get from the early maps, which Jeff himself was particularly interested in. I'll just zoom in on those so you can see them. You've got information about basements and stairways down into basements, stairs up to main doors, all the structures. You've got here, you can see in the left-hand map, my red cursor over the Leathersellers Hall, which by 1916 had expanded across the street and taken over all of this building as well. You had here a school, so there was detail of schools. We have lots of information, and we try to capture it as faithfully as possible, but keeping it in the context of a modern structure. And Jeff is currently looking at some of the artistic references and theatre performances and things like that that link into this area to see how they connect through. Just one other example, and I can't dwell on these for too long because I will run out of time quite quickly. Here's 3 from the post-war period. And we were talking about change, and one of the things that particularly interests us in the context of all this is how change in literature is recorded, and importantly, how as change speeds up, we get to see that recorded in some way within popular culture. Just draw your attention to a couple of things. This building here, I mentioned right at the beginning, the Aviva Tower. So you can see that it exists in 1971. It's not there in the 1953 map. It was in fact built in the middle of the 1960s. That tower was refurbished in about 1990. Still exists. It's now earmarked for demolition and will be gone in the next sort of round of skyscrapers, whenever that might be. But we're talking about a building that now has a life period of perhaps 70 years. Okay, maybe that's not too bad. There's some buildings here which have changed by 1971. Again, some 1960s buildings. They were there in 1989. They have gone. They have been replaced and removed. And there's an area here which in 53 through to 71 was the same, was built over by 89 and has also been destroyed. We're seeing buildings now that have a life cycle of 40 to 50 years. And these aren't small buildings, these are major concrete structures. And overall, we're seeing a lot of change as it impacts on the City of London. So we've built ourselves a database and we've started to collect information to link together the things that Shakespeare saw and wrote about into that component of the database and measure that through, or reflect that through changes, through time, and through sort of graphics into reflecting how an area of the City of London is changing so much. It's taken off in all sorts of different directions you can imagine. It's given us lots of little leads to follow through and to follow up on, and we're constantly adding to the database. We believe there's quite a lot more to be gained from the Leathersellers library. When we get more access to it, we'll go back and delve a bit further. But that's it. That is, in a nutshell, my 20-minute tea time talk on City of London, St Helens and the City of London, and how it's changed from Shakespeare's time to a modern world of skyscrapers. So thanks very much. Escape that. And I'm going to stop sharing and we'll just go back to the graphics.
Okay, thank you very much, Seppi, for that. That's been a very, very interesting talk there. Now, does anyone have any questions? Haven't seen anyone put any in so far.
Don't know if people know how to do it, Chris. You might just want to just explain it again.
Yes, I think. Yes. So basically, if you wish to ask any questions, if you can maybe if you can go into the Q&A area. It's the wee triangle, the triangle, circle, and dot. Okay, we should be able to have some people putting questions.
So I got a question from Jim asking when we started it. I'm just trying to remember when we actually purchased the OS master map to start the whole thing off. I think it was about May time. It was post first lockdown. So we started putting it basically it was all done over the summer really, as a sort of summer project, collecting information. The maps themselves, although they're quite complex, once you've got the rectification sorted out, it's relatively straightforward to put them all together. You do have lots of decisions to make about whether something shown on a map of one period is the same thing as something shown on a later period, and how do you bring them together. But it is it's interesting. It's an interesting process. Who was the map maker? That's a very good question, actually. I don't know the answer to that. That map was provided to us by the Leathersellers Hall as a map in the form that you saw it, and with no other details on it. So I'm sure there is information, but I don't have access to it. Jeff might actually, but I haven't actually asked him about it. So look at building heights. That's an interesting question. So Henry's asked, have I thought about looking at the change in building heights over time? It's exactly one of the things we're doing. The Leathersellers Hall's library is really interesting because it contains an incredible amount of detail about the use of each building and the use of each floor of each building. So we know, or we think we know, and can bring to the map when we get access back to the archives, the height, the number of floors in each building and what each floor was used for. So the maps that we've got currently from 1676 are coded simply based on the 1676 map and not brought in anything we've currently got from Leathersellers. But we've got information about what trade whether it was a shop, whether someone was using it for some sort of office purposes, whether it was just residential. And it includes all the owners and potentially the tenants. So it's this information that has been used to identify where Shakespeare lived. So the third dimension is fascinating. And actually, one of the things I haven't mentioned is that it's going on a step further in that we have someone building us some 3D models, very similar to what the 3D models that I referenced right at the beginning for modern London, but using some gaming software to build a Tudor version of the parish. Where have I got to? No, we didn't. And the question there from Peter about using copper plate maps, the reason we didn't is that we wanted something that would give us a consistent, best possible footprint for buildings with structures, and that would link into, as far as we could, the Leathersellers archive. So we're aware of earlier maps. We've looked at quite a lot, but decided that the best starting place to give us consistency was that 1676 map. There may be others out there, of course, that would be better, but we decided just to stick with what we could get from that one archive. And Peter's just sent a message saying that the map was produced by a team led by John Ogilby. So thank you for that. Mary's comment was barred to shard. I should have thought of that one, shouldn't I? That was, yeah, very good. Let's see if there's any others. Nick's asked if we used the Historic Towns Trust's new map of medieval London. No, we haven't. The interesting thing is we weren't really trying to produce in fact, we didn't start off by trying to produce a medieval map at all. It was about trying to find where the nunnery was actually positioned and where things like the Two Bucket Well were, and other things that Jeff has identified, some of which we found, many of which we can't. So it's about sort of trying to merge together my interests, if you like, and what he's been trying to do through the V&A. The church, I didn't mention the church because there's a lot I could tell you about it, but it's supposed to be, other than the Westminster Abbey, it's a church with the most, what's the word I'm looking for, tombs and other sorts of things in it in London. It's interesting, and you may have realised when you looked at that photograph that it has two naves. It's a very unusual church from that point of view. In the northern nave was exclusively for the nuns, and the southern nave was for the local parishioners. And actually the maps show when the walls between the two naves at some point were removed, and you've got that detail, that internal detail, which is quite interesting because we're actually beginning, if you like, under the modern GIS era to go back to putting internals into buildings and collect that information because it's becoming increasingly important. We're sort of going full circle. Jim has asked, any plans to publish the maps we've made? No, none at all. It was just purely of interest. Jeff might use them when he launches his book, but that's purely to help him with book sales, I suspect. But that's it. So, but it's one of those things that I think is a sort of fun project to do. It's something you can do when you're semi-retired. And Will has asked, were there any historic map features you could not identify and explain? Not so much on the 1676 map. That was pretty good, but there's lots of stuff that you think you'd like to know more about. I did mention, I completely forgot to mention again Crosby Hall, and it was in that last slide. Crosby Hall is really an interesting building, and in fact, Crosby Hall is the third building from Shakespeare's time that still exists today, but it doesn't exist in the parish in St Helens. In around 1900, it was picked up lock, stock and barrel and moved to Chelsea Embankment, where you can still go and visit it. It's a fabulous building. So it is interesting to see how some of our history has been preserved, but in some different locations, as it were. Okay, that sort of uses up my half an hour, Chris. We're done.
Yes, and I think the questions as well seem to have dried up as well. So we've seemed to have exhausted everyone there. So yes, it's that's been it was again a very interesting talk, and have to say thank you very much for bringing it to us. I have to say, hope that everyone enjoyed. I hope everyone enjoyed this, and if they have any feedback from this initial talk to help us improve and develop this, please send us a message so we can take on board any of that advice and any thoughts and advice. So I have to say that our next talk is going to take place on the 21st of January. That will be the formal start, and that will be a talk on the Waterloo campaign, a mapping perspective, and that will be given by the John Peaty, again of the Society, who's the convener of the Historical Mapping Group. So I hope everyone enjoyed this, and hopefully see you in 2 weeks' time. Right. Thank you very much then.